And welcome into the roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you. And shouting in Washington is nothing new. It goes back all the way back to the founding of the country. But a little bit more shouting this past weekend on Wednesday as the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee got together, and a little bit of an interesting conversation back and forth. We got two gentlemen that can provide some interesting insight into this as well. Lauren Smith, president of Skyline Policy Risk Group, joins us, as well as Randy Mellett, senior advisor at Imaginovate. And gentlemen, it seems like you all are becoming regulars here on the show. Thanks for joining us there as well. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was of particular concern at this meeting on Wednesday, where a lot of perspective was lent, let's say, to the situation. Lauren, let me start with you. If you're in freight right now, in terms of how much is being said as opposed to how much is being done, are you more or less optimistic about the way things are going now that we have a split Congress, but also the fact that the Republicans now control committees in the House?
Well, I think a couple of the key things, Bill, are that freight infrastructure and spending of the IIJA money on freight, key freight corridors, freight nodes, that's the key priority. And so from the freight industry's perspective, it's not even so much a question of are you happy or sad. It's just you've got to keep that pressure on. And so you have to keep agitating for, the administration to spend, more and more of the money, to get a larger share of the piece for freight infrastructure. As far as, having Republicans in Congress goes, I think there's also a focus on regulatory issues there, where the freight industry probably looks at the Republicans as being sort of their protection on the regulatory side, like put pressure on making sure that freight efficiency is the highest regulatory priority, or certainly at the table as one of the highest priorities. So on that regulatory and infrastructure spend side, I think that's probably their key priority. I think that's what they were putting pressure on.
Randy, as you look at that situation, what are you seeing in terms of, is the freight industry going to have to, as Lauren said, apply that much pressure and to make sure they get the money they need in the areas they want it?
Yeah, I think Lauren's exactly right. This is one of those situations where you've got a serious change, a really significant change in how money's doled out. A lot of it now is grant processes, a lot of different ways to collect that money. A lot more of it's coming from general funds rather than the highway trust funds. So anytime you get this notion where the agencies are expected to interpret the will of Congress, it really, really is incumbent on the affected parties to stay really involved in that process to make sure that it does not go awry somehow.
Gotcha. Let me stay with you for the next question. We'll flip-flop back and forth here. Obviously, Speaker McCarthy, and this is for more or less a 50,000-foot question, but Speaker McCarthy a little bit tenuous in terms of obviously the war that he had to fight and the concessions he had to make in order to become Speaker. Does that change anything as terms of how well this Congress will act in terms of what the freight industry may get? And again, that could be anybody in any industry. But does that make things a lot more difficult at this point in terms of how unstable, that may not be the greatest word, that the House is at this point?
There will be certain areas that of course becomes important, but infrastructure is one of those things that traditionally has been more bipartisan than most other things in Congress. Some of the biggest ports in the country, for instance, are in areas that are heavily dominated by Democrat politics and are represented by Democrats. They want to make sure that they're getting the best deals and the best funding that they can for those areas too. We're also just coming off of the infrastructure crisis that was took place over COVID. So this is really front of mind for everybody in Congress right now. So in this particular area, I don't see that McCarthy or the Republicans' thin margins really make all that much difference, at least right now.
Lauren, same question to you.
Yeah, I think that this is probably a more of a unifying issue for the Republicans to sort of grumble gently, like, the administration, they need to be focusing more on freight. They should be doing more. That's sort of an easy unifying theme for Republicans to have. but I think as we get into actual legislation, I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging. But in general, I think infrastructure this year, probably the key things that the transportation committees will be working on include the FAA reauthorization. That may get a little bit more interesting as you see some of the flashpoints there. But as far as infrastructure oversight, it's more a question of just sort of like exerting that pressure on the administration to, spend the money on key freight arteries, the connecting points, the multimodal nodes of the freight network, and then on regulation, making sure that the administration, whatever the regulatory priorities are on labor, safety, health, the environment, also take into account the efficiency of the freight network.
Gotcha there. If you want to go back and look at the article that we have on freightwaves.com, we have it, just a quick picture of it here. This is the one that we're talking about and referencing that John Gallagher wrote. Randy, back to you here. Will there be legislation, do you think, that comes out of this Congress that will lower the cost of trucking? We saw a lot of things come through that have elevated that. A lot of the comments that were made during that session on Wednesday said, look, the price of trucking is going up, which means it's a pass-through. Americans are going to pay more. Inflation is running rampant in that area, and that's why costs are up across the board. Do you think we'll see legislation that will lower the cost of trucking, which hopefully lowers the cost of goods for Americans?
There are a couple pieces of legislation out there that would lower the cost of trucking around the edges, I would say. They address new equipment and perhaps some rebates on that. There's discussion around getting rid of the excise tax. There is a discussion of lowering the age limit or expanding that program to make it easier to hire drivers. All those bump up against other things, though, like labor, like safety. And so again, I don't see a panacea, but I also don't see anything that's going to really significantly raise the cost of trucking, which is also just as likely to happen in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Lauren, same question to you. Let me back up a little bit and just ask, is there anything at all that could possibly lower the cost of trucking? Could they do anything if it's, as Randy said, only a fringe kind of an issue?
Well, again, the work that the federal government is doing on the freight network itself overall is probably the most important and applicable area where they'll do that. Could Congress change the rules with legislation, as you mentioned, the excise tax or some of the other areas with respect to labor or localization? Unfortunately, there probably won't be any significant changes that will help the economics of trucking. But I thought that last comment by Randy was really good. Probably we won't see anything to significantly increase the cost of trucking on the other side, but I probably not a lot of movement. Again, the major issue this year is going to be the debt ceiling that Congress has to figure out some way to raise. I think there was some encouraging movement last week with Kevin McCarthy meeting face-to-face with President Biden to sort of open negotiations on how they can take a look at that. And that, I think, will probably result in some sort of major legislative agreement over the summer, which probably will have some spending reforms, maybe some spending cuts. And, maybe if they're a little bit more creative about it, they can figure out some policy changes that might be desired by some of the key stakeholder industries. And so certainly that's going to be a risk point, both a positive and a negative risk point for things that might happen. So we'll be watching that very closely as that comes up over the summer. But probably not anything particular on lowering trucking, the costs of trucking until maybe the next infrastructure bill.
We've got about a minute left here, Lauren. Kind of quickly here, and kind of more of a 50,000-foot question. Given this Congress, given the state that it's in, given McCarthy's tenuous position, what are your expectations for this Congress in terms of what they're going to be putting out this year? Is this going to be business as usual, or do you think it may be more of a stalemate, or is there going to be more and more negotiations going on?
I think that they're going to have a result on the debt ceiling, which is going to be like by the end of the year, we'll say, that actually wasn't so bad. And then the FAA reauthorization, I think, is probably going to happen by the end of this year or possibly the beginning of next year. And there's also a farm bill coming up too, very important for agriculture and transportation related to agriculture that I think is going to be probably done again over the next 12 months. So I think it's going to be relatively productive. I actually am. I'm kind of optimistic after the crazy things we've seen over the past few months.
Interesting. Randy, I give you the last word here. You got about 25 seconds.
Well, I think Lauren has hit the high points, though I would add that I think that the Republican House will pass largely on a party line basis all the appropriations bills on the heels of the debt ceiling fight.
All right, this is going to be an interesting term, to say the least. Lauren Smith, Randy Miller, thanks so much for joining us.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll take a short break. Be back right after this.